The city of Rotterdam sent over daffodils, a noctuid moth. The daffodils bloomed in the first weeks of April, Allegheny woodrat. They were everywhere, American bittern. They were yellow, American burying beetle. It was April, and then the temperature was 90 degrees, and all the daffodils died immediately. Aragos skipper, all at the same time, Atlantic hawksbill sea turtle. This happened right where they were living, Atlantic Ridley sea turtle. It was early April, bald eagle.
In November of the previous year, a big piece of the Antarctic Pine Island glacier broke off. Banded sunfish. A crack had formed in the glacier in the middle of the previous year, Barron's buck moth, and then by November the piece had just broken off, Bicknell's thrush. It had just taken a few months from crack to breaking point, black rail. The iceberg that was formed was 26 miles by 10 miles, black red horse. Then in the following March, the March of the same year of the 90-degree early April, the Larsen B ice shelf shattered and separated from the Antarctic Peninsula, black skimmer.
All of this happened far away from them, black tern. They had never even been near Antarctica, Blanding's turtle. They heard about all this cracking and breaking away on the news, and then they began to search over the internet for information on what was going on, blue whale. On the internet they found an animation of the piece of the Antarctic Pine Island glacier breaking off, blue breast darter. After they found this, they often called this animation up and just watched it over and over on their screen in their dimly lit room, blue spotted salamander.
In the animation, which was really just a series of 6 or so satellite photographs, a crack would appear in the middle of the glacier. Bog, buck, moth. Then a few frames later, the crack would widen and extend itself towards the edge, and then the piece would break off. Bog turtle. They wondered often about the details. Brook floater, buffalo pebble snail. What does this breaking off sound like? Canadian lynx. Or what it was like to be there on the piece that was breaking off. Krullian warbler. Did waves form? Checkered white. Was there a tsunami? Chittenango ovate amber snail. What had it been like for the penguins or the fish? Cub shell.
On the internet, they realized that Iceland's Vatnajökull Glacier is melting by about 3 feet a year. Common loon. That the Bering Glacier in Alaska recently lost as much as 7.5 miles in a 60-day period. Common nighthawk. That the European Alps lost half their ice over the last century, and that many of the rivers of Europe were likely to be gone in 20 to 30 years' time. Common sand dragon. That the Columbia Glacier in Alaska will continue to recede, possibly at a rate of as much as 10 miles in 10 years. Common tern. That 36 cubic miles of ice had melted from glaciers in West Antarctica in the past decade, and that alone had raised sea levels worldwide by about 1/60th of an inch. Cooper's hawk.
That on Mount Rainier, warmer temperatures were causing the ice to melt under the glacier, and this caused water to suddenly burst out of the glacier and race down the mountain. Cougar. The tropical ice caps were disappearing even faster. Deepwater sculpin. That a glacier on the Kalkaia ice cap is retreating by 500 feet per year. Dwarf wedge mussel. That Kilimanjaro in East Africa has lost 82% of its area in 88 years. Eastern box turtle. That Pakistan was thinking about melting their glaciers so they could get some more water for their people, although this was not recommended by the United Nations and might not actually happen. Eastern hognose snake. They learned that all this melting began to accelerate in 1988. eastern sand darter. That the rate of ice lost had doubled since 1988. Eastern spadefoot toad. That 1988 was a sort of turning point year, as it was the beginning of each year being the hottest year on record, year after year. Eastern spiny softshell.
They had been alive in 1988, Eskimo curlew. They could not even remember thinking at all about the weather that year. Extra striped snaketail. When they really thought about it, they had no memory of any year being any hotter than any year in general. Fact, pocketbook. They remembered a few hot summers and a few mild winters, but they were more likely to remember certain specific storms, like the blizzard of 1976. Fence lizard. They did not remember heat as glaciers remember heat, deep in the center, causing cracking or erupting. Finback whale. They had spent 1988 living in various parts of the country, fringed vulvata. None of them knew each other in 1988. Frosted elfin. Some of them were involved with other people. Guilt, darta. Some of them thought about finishing college and getting jobs. Golden eagle. Yet some just thought about hitting baseballs. Gold-winged warbler.
At various moments, they joined each other and many others in thinking about Pan Am Flight 103 that had exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland. Grasshopper sparrow. And then again, they all noticed on the same day when the US shot down the Iran Air Flight 655, supposedly by accident, in the Persian Gulf. Gravel chub. And several of them did not go to the beach in 1988 because the beach near them was in New Jersey, and that year beaches in New Jersey were closed because of medical waste coming ashore. Grey petaltail. Some of them were trying to rid themselves of drunk boyfriends and thought so much about this that there was little room for thinking about other things like the warmth or beaches. Grey wolf.
And some of them were living, for part of that year, right at the edge of where the Wisconsin Glacier had ended, thousands of years ago. And the town in which they lived had a flat part and a hilly part, as a result. But even though the geography of their daily life was so clearly formed by a glacier, they didn't really think about the warm year and things melting. Green floater. Some of them worked at an anarchist bookstore. Green sea turtle. Some of them had tans that summer that they'd got from walking around outside because they needed to be outside walking around in order to think about how best to be somewhat content in this life right now. Grizzled skipper.
Some of them drove cabs. Harbor porpoise. None of them really fell in love, but some of them had lovers. Hart's tongue fern. After the peace of the Antarctic Pine Island Glacier broke off, they could not stop thinking about glaciers, and the way they thought about glaciers the most was by reading about them on the internet late at night, their eyes blurring and their shoulders tight. Hellbender. There they sometimes found arguments from the side that the oil drillers celebrated, the side that said the melting did not matter. Henry Zelfin.
Sometimes, if it was really late at night, and if they had written on a small notepad beside their computer an especially long list of things that were melting, as they tended to do, they would read this argument, liked by oil drillers, and try to be reassured by the information that if the Antarctic Pine Island Glacier melted away, it didn't matter much, because it would only raise sea levels by 1/4 of an inch. Henslow's sparrow. 1/4 of an inch, they would think. Herodias underwing. 1/4 of an inch does not matter. Hessel's hairstreak. Then questions would surface through this blurry comfort of small amounts of rising oceans. Horned lark. Would the Antarctic Pine Island Glacier melt just on its own? They would wonder. Houghton's goldenrod. wouldn't the RHUL also be melting at the same time? Humpback whale, and the Alps, and the tropical ice caps, and the poles, Indiana bat.
And then they read that while 1/4 of an inch does not seem like much, a rise of 1 foot of ocean level typically means that shorelines end up 100 feet or more inland. Iron-coloured shiner. A sea rise of just 3 feet in Bangladesh would put 1/2 of that nation underwater, displacing more than 100 million people. Jer Underwing. Already on the island of Tuvalu, farmers must grow their plants in containers because the rising sea level has seeped into the groundwater. Jefferson Salamander. The 4 nations of Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands and Tokelau Islands, each made up of many islands, will most certainly be entirely displaced in the next 30 years. Kana Blue.
They themselves tended to live on islands, and thinking about what this meant had provoked them to think so much about this rising ocean level, and then to feel that the breaking off of the Antarctic Pine Island Glacier was all about them, or not all about them, but as having a scary relevance to their lives. King Rail. They often lived on an island in the Pacific, and they often lived on an island in the Atlantic, Lake Chubsucker. They thought of these 2 residences of theirs as opposites, although both were places of great economic privilege and resources, places that themselves consumed large amounts of resources, and consumed more and more resources all the time. Lake Sturgeon.
One preferred to think of itself as local, and often as in resistance to the United States. And one preferred to think of itself as international, and often as the centre of finance and culture for the United States. Least bitten. One had a smallish city, and one had one of the largest cities in the world. Least term. One was 600 square miles, and one was 26 square miles. Leatherback sea turtle. Both were likely to feel the effects of the rising ocean, although many of the residents of both were pretending that what was happening to the nations of Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands and Tokelau Islands did not really foretell anything relevant to them at all. Leedy's rose root. Often late at night, to allay their worries, they tried to see climate change as just one more tendency of life towards change. Little Bluet.
They tried to look forward to the new fjord that would be created by the receding Columbia Glacier in Alaska. Loggerhead sea turtle. They were fascinated by fjords, and there will soon be a new one to visit in 10 years, they would say to themselves. Loggerhead shrike. Perhaps even new plants would evolve there. Long-ear sunfish. Or they tried to be comforted about how they grew up in a town that was located right at the edge of where the Wisconsin glacier had ended its journey. Longhead darter. And because it had ended there, the soil in this area was especially rich, as the glacier pushed topsoil before it as it moved, then dumped it right where the town was now. Longtail salamander.
For years they had eaten off the wealth of the glacier, as their family had lived in the hilly section of town and had grown a vegetable garden in the backyard in the rich topsoil. Marbled salamander. Or they liked to think about the scientist who claimed that in terms of patterns of heating and cooling on the Earth's surface, the Earth should be entering a new ice age. Massassauga. It is long overdue, he claimed. Moon eye yet, according to him. This ice age has been perhaps counteracted by human climatic interference. Masi Valvata. So maybe we were better off. maybe better fire than ice, although who knew what gods of demons were being angered and what they would do with their anger, modeled Dusky Wing.
They were not scientists and could not figure out what to blame or what the long-term consequences might be. And even if they were scientists, they might not be able to figure this out. Mountain Brook Lamprey. They made no claim to answers, they just noticed things. Mud sunfish. And the more they read, the more confused they became. Mud turtle. And at this moment in their lives, there was more to read than ever before, and it was easier than ever before to acquire as it came through their computers. And all the time the computers had newer and better search engines, making more and more specific information easier to find. New England Cottontail. They knew there were certain enemies in this story, such as Bush with his refusal to sign the Kyoto Accord, and certain industries. Northeastern beach tiger beetle. But they also knew that the Kyoto Accord was too little, too late. Northern cricket frog. They also knew that they didn't want to let excessive information paralyze them. Northern goshawk. Or excessive guilt. Northern harrier.
They felt they had to say that they knew that they were in part responsible for it, whatever it was that was causing this, because they lived in the place that used the largest amount of the stuff most likely to cause this warming. Northern wild monkshood. They lived among those who used the most stuff up, who burned the most stuff, who produced the most stuff, and other things like that. Olympia marble. And even if they tried to live their lives with less stuff than others, they still benefited and were a part of the system that produced all this stuff, and because of this they had a hard time figuring out how to move beyond their own personal renewed commitment to denial of stuff, and yet their awareness of how they benefited daily from being a part of the system that used up the most stuff. Osprey. So glaciers were not near them, but they obsessed them. Peregrine falcon.
They wondered if it was because of a story a friend had once told them, Perseus' dusky wing. She'd gone hiking with her uncle and her sister, pied-billed grebe. They'd hiked up to a glacier, pine barrens Blewett. On the way there she got tired and her uncle had picked her up and put her on his shoulder, pine pinion moth. She was tall when they arrived at the glacier, pink mucket. They arrived at the glacier and she could see it. It had a special light, she said, piping plover. It had a special light, and this special light in its coldness had been so intense to her. Pug-nosed, shiner, pygmy snaketail. The sun in her eyes, queen snake, the special light, rayed bean, the coldness, red-fin shiner, all of it had comforted her.
Red-headed woodpecker. And when she told this story, she had started to cry, and they had not understood why she had begun to cry in her telling of a story of comfort. Red-shouldered hawk. She had told them her story before they began to stay up late at night, encountering glaciers on their computer screen. Before they watched over and over the animation of the Antarctic Pine Island Glacier breaking off. Regal fritillary. Before they began to enter the word glacier into Google over and over. Right whale. Before they thought about their relationship with things big and cold and full of fresh water. Roseate tern.
Now they found her story intense and moving, and often dwelled on it while looking at the animation of the Antarctic Pine Island Glacier breaking off. Round white fish. They envied her for touching a glacier, something that mattered so much in everyone's lives, even though so few people had actual contact with it. Sandplain Gelardia. She knew this thing that was about their life, about everyone's life, in a way they did not, Scarlet Bluet. Sometimes they thought that glaciers interested them, because glaciers are like zombies, slow-moving and full of stuff and can't be stopped. Sea Beach Amaranth. Like how in movies you can put a bunch of knives and bullets in a zombie and it keeps on moving. Seaside Sparrow.
That is how they thought of glaciers. Sedge wrens, sigh whale. They move and no one can stop them whichever way they go. Sharp-shinned hawk. You can't pin them down and hold them in place. Short-eared owl. Nor can you deter them when they start moving. Short-nosed sturgeon. And they have history. Silver chub. They have water in layers, sort of like a tree's yearly cycles. Small-footed bat. As they melt, things embedded in them are uncovered. Southern leopard frog. In one, a British warplane. Southern sprite. Southern sprite. And others, various tools or buildings or humans from other times. Sperm whale. And glaciers have 66% of the world's fresh water. Spoonhead sculpin.
That also interested them, as many political struggles of the earlier parts of the previous century involved fresh water, and they also figured this is going to be true of the current century, as fresh water was getting to be more and more necessary, as more and more people lived on the earth, and as they lived, they polluted fresh water, and used up more and more of the fresh water stored in various underground water tables, and developed more and more sophisticated pumps, spotted data. Already, but a few years into this new century, there were water riots in various parts of the continent on which they lived, and a spotted turtle. Water is a force and a resource. Spruce, grouse.
It was April and it was the 90s.
Streamline,
Could they not think
and it
about
was April and it was in the 90s. How could they not think about things melting all the time?
Degrees
Tawny,
and the daffodils died immediately.
They tried to balance out their anxieties with loud attempts at celebrations of life. Tiger, salamander. They tried to do this in often ineffectual ways. Timber, rattlesnake. So they might make out in public while standing in line at the grocery, or just drink too much with friends and thus stay out late, chatting happily in dark and smoky rooms, where there was no evidence of any glacier, or any rising ocean level, or even any air, really. Or they might go home and smoke some pot and lie on their bed and watch shows about nature on the television with the sound off, and think about how soft the bed can feel at such moments, how deeply it could let them enter at such moments.
Or they might talk loudly and excitedly with friends about the latest blockbuster summer movie, as if that really mattered to them and they could live with the changing landscape because they had things like movies and books and friends and drugs, things that were common in cities, and when in the cities they liked to tell themselves that this was enough, that these things were good enough so that the melting didn't matter. Tomah, mayfly. They were anxious and were covering things over. Unnamed dragonfly species. They were anxious and they were paralysed by the largeness and the connectedness of systems, a largeness of relation that they liked to think about and often celebrated, but now seemed unbearably tragic. Upland Sandpiper.
The connected relationship between water and land seemed deeply damaged, perhaps beyond repair in numerous places. Vesper sparrow. The systems of relation between living things of all sorts seem to have become in recent centuries so hierarchically human. that things not human were dying at an unprecedented rate. Wavy rate lamp muscle, and the systems of human governments and corporations felt so large and unchangeable, and so distant from them, yet the effects of their actions felt so connected and so immediate to what was happening. Whippoorwill. They knew this, but didn't know what else to do. Wood turtle. And so they just went on living while talking loudly, worm snake. Living and watching on a screen, things far away from them melting. Yellow-breasted chat.